Syrian. I am the director of the Hellenic Studies program. And we have today, I think, a very important conversation that has been kind of put on the shelf for the last year because of the COVID crisis. The conversation today is between two individuals that have been very intimately involved with the crisis in Lebanon and Greece, and a third co-host, but also co-participant, Kaveh Khoshnood, who will also introduce himself a little bit later as soon as I end up my brief introduction. This panel conversation is also co-sponsored by the Program on Refugees, Forced Displacement and Humanitarian Response, the Council on Middle East Studies, and the Hellenic Studies program at the Macmillan Center here at Yale. The logic of this conversation today between Greece and Lebanon, at least from our perspective as a Hellenic Studies program, is that in the past, the conversations that we have organized have been primarily oriented towards either Turkey or the European Union. And we seem to be forgetting that the refugee crisis is throughout the Middle East. Perhaps the most hit country is Lebanon. So we wanted to turn our attention to the East and see how the two countries are dealing some similar situations, but also some radically different parameters that they have to navigate through. So I think this conversation will be illuminating for those of us that only see the problem as constrained or restricted to one particular country and its own circumstances. I also want to say that I will be monitoring with Kaveh, but Kaveh is also a specialist in the field himself. He works here at Yale. So before we introduce the speakers, I will ask Kaveh to introduce himself and his work. And after that, I will introduce Epaminondas Farmakis. Kaveh will introduce Sally Abi Khalil. And then Kaveh will lead the first question. The questions will be addressed to both of the speakers, and they will answer to the extent that the question pertains to both countries. And then we'll continue until the end of the question part for the speakers, at which point we will open up the conversation to the audience, and you can send your questions through the chat feature of Zoom. Okay, so Kaveh, you want to take over and tell us what it is that you do?
Sure. Thank you so much, George. It's wonderful to be on this panel. I am Kaveh Khoshnood. I'm an associate professor at Yale School of Public Health. I was born and raised in Iran and experienced political violence and the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War as a teenager. And I had the privilege and fortune of being able to leave the country and come to the United States and live with my own uncle. This is an opportunity that is very few refugees, as we know, have access to. Although I didn't qualify as a refugee, this experience of being forced to leave my country and my family at the age of 17, I think stayed with me for a long time. As a public health academic, I have focused primarily on the HIV/AIDS problem. I would say for about 2 decades. I worked in the United States and China and Russia. And then about 7 years ago, I decided that I want to do something about war, conflict, refugees, and displaced population. And I pivoted my research and teaching to health issues of refugees and forcibly displaced population. I had the good fortune of being able to get connected to colleagues at the Faculty of Health Sciences at the American University of Beirut through my colleague at Yale, Marcia Inhorn. And I learned a ton from the colleagues at the American University of Beirut, but also with the civil society organizations. And I've been conducting research, public health projects in Lebanon for the past 6 or 7 years. The work began with an HIV/AIDS related project among men who have sex with men, both Lebanese and Syrians. Next, I worked on a substance abuse project that's ongoing. Again, it's both in the Lebanese and Syrian population. And then third, I learned about the fact that cancer prevention and treatment is very much understudied, especially in the refugee population. It's not non-communicable diseases in general, but something like cancer is something that's kind of not on the priority list or agenda of many humanitarian organizations or even the Ministry of Health. So I've been also focusing on the issue of cancer. So with that brief introduction, I'll pass it back to George to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Kaveh, and thank you also for the biographical introduction to your relationship to the topic. I forgot to mention, but those of you that do know me know that I come from Cyprus. And I also share some of this experience, which is why I'm partly invested in this, not professionally, obviously, but personally. I am what they call now displaced, internally displaced individual. We used to call ourselves refugees, we still do, coming from the north of Cyprus and moving to the south in 1974. And I also want to point out one of the issues that makes my situation at least a fortunate one is that watching these past few years, what is happening in Greece particularly, I find myself considering my situation one of the lucky ones. We've never had to endure the kind of difficulties that these people are facing. And not only that, in a certain sense, I benefited from my status as a refugee, because the reason I am now here today is that I received a scholarship from the American government, which was part of the refugee relief program of the USAID, the program that covers the Middle East, through which I was able to come to the United States and study. So there are many, many ways that richer countries can help the situation there. It's not simply they mediate humanitarian relief, but also long-term development plans that also include educational scholarships. So I wanted to put that out because sometimes we wonder, what is going to happen? What can we do for these people that are in these unfortunate situations? And there are good outcomes of policies. We just need to be a little bit more targeted and long-term in our planning. So with that little personal note, I want to introduce Epaminondas Farmakis. I have known Epaminondas for the last 20 years because he was actually at the time working for the Niarchos Foundation that funds the program in Hellenic Studies at Yale. And I came here 20 years ago. Yes, exactly. And Epaminondas was part of the picture of the development of the program. But he is here today as a representative and the founder of Human Rights 360, an NGO organization in Greece. And he has over the 20 years experience in civil society and allocated more than 1.1 billion to more than 1,300 nonprofit in over 65 countries. So it's a big organization. Epaminondas is known for his nonprofit management and fundraising skills. And while a believer in philanthropy, is eager to introduce new impact-driven programs and innovation needed in this particular sector. He was previously the managing director of Solidarity Now, created by the Open Society Foundation. He was a director of the EEA Norway Grants NGO Fund in Greece and the Bodosakis Foundation, the president and CEO of the Philanthropy Advisory Unit LPs, SA, and COO of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and a financial advisor for Merrill Lynch. He has postgraduate work in the US Senate at the Office of the Minority Leader, followed by an MBA and MSFA's degree in Georgetown University. He believes in advocacy, and this is what his whole life has been, in communication as a tool of awareness and positive change, and is a feature in Greek and international media. We're very happy to have him here today, and welcome, Epaminondas. Kaveh, you can introduce Sally as well, also a very rich be there in her activities.
Sure, thank you. Sally Abi Khalil is a humanitarian and development practitioner with 20 years of experience in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria. She is currently the country director of Oxfam in Lebanon and has served as chair of the Lebanon Humanitarian INGO Forum. As the first Lebanese woman to run a major international NGO within the Syria response in Lebanon, she has led humanitarian response programs supporting youth and women with social innovation and social entrepreneurship initiatives, promoted the right to decent work for the establishment of civil society networks, and promoted feminist approaches toward leadership and collective action. Sally was a World Fellow at Yale in 2020. Of course, she did it virtually, and I had the pleasure of meeting with her virtually. I hope at some point I get to come to Lebanon again and see you in person, Sally. So wonderful to have you. So as George mentioned, we're going to start. We have a couple of questions. We will start, and I'll start with Sally. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is about the reports I've been reading about. We know Lebanon has imposed a lot of movement restrictions, both on the Lebanese population, but also among the Syrians. And what I've been reading is that the movement, the restriction on movement for Syrians is sort of much more, I guess it's discriminatory, some would describe it. Can you tell us about these movement restrictions and what impact they've had on the Syrian population in Lebanon?
Thank you, Kaveh, for the introductions, and thank you, George, also for hosting this talk. And I'm very honored to be part of this panel. So it's lovely to be engaged with all of you on this very important topic, and I look forward to the discussion with the audience. Yes, so I mean, Lebanon, as every other country in the world, has been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In a couple of weeks, we would be 1 year into the first lockdown that took place in Lebanon. So around March 15th of last year was the first full countrywide lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, this pandemic has come at a time when Lebanon's already experiencing significant and very serious crises already. We have had a popular uprising that started in October 2019. This immediately followed a complete economic meltdown and collapse in the country, with the currency losing around 80% of its value, with inflation ranging between 200 to 350% for staple basic goods. And there in August 2020, there was the Beirut blast explosion that annihilated a significant portion of the city and impacted. And so this is sort of the wider context of Lebanon, in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. So a series of crises where refugees in Lebanon are living within this sort of melting pot of crises and significant challenges. So, just imagine putting yourself as a refugee. No one wants to be a refugee, especially one in such a extremely challenging context, to say the least. So Lebanon has responded with several different lockdowns, from extremely severe to less severe, depending on how the pandemic is sort of the waves of the pandemic have gone. But those that have been most severely impacted by the lockdowns, especially in an economic situation that was already quite dire, were the most vulnerable populations. And specifically, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are considered the most vulnerable. I mean, just to paint a picture on some of exactly how dire the situation is, the most recent findings by UNHCR as vulnerability assessment that they do on a yearly basis points to 9 out of 10 refugee families are now living in extreme poverty in Lebanon. They are accumulating more debt than any other time in the almost 10 years they've been displaced. So just to remind you also, in mid-March, we're also hitting the 10th anniversary of the Syria crisis. So refugees in Lebanon, Syrian refugees in Lebanon have now been displaced for a decade. The most of the Syrian refugee families are food insecure currently, so they're struggling to nurture and feed their families. They're adopting negative coping strategies as well in terms of food security, and so we are seeing specifically women skip meals. Or putting their children to bed earlier so that they don't necessarily have to have dinner, because most Syrian refugees are daily laborers. This requires them, and work in the construction or the agricultural sector. This requires them to move to be able to access any livelihood opportunities. But with the current lockdowns, they're unable to move freely, and with the economic crisis anyway, these work opportunities that generally were much more accessible and available are no longer there. Also, in order to impose some of these lockdown measures, there's security checkpoints at several points in different parts of the country to ensure that people are abiding by these checkpoints, and we are seeing discriminatory measures more towards Syrian refugee populations, as well as Palestinian refugee populations. I'll touch very briefly on the Palestinian refugees as well, so not to forget about them either, since we're talking more broadly about refugees. Are being discriminated against by security checkpoints, noting that around 90% of Syrian refugees are currently not registered, don't have their official legal papers in Lebanon, which of course poses a problem and raises some protection threats as well. So just briefly on the Palestinian refugees, I don't want to take too much time, also Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are some of the most popular, some of the most vulnerable groups as well in the country. We also see severe poverty rates among the Palestinian refugees, with very, very limited access to livelihoods opportunities as well. And also the same applies within an economic situation that is so dire, and the challenges of the lockdown and the measures, the very strict measures that the government have taken. The Palestinian refugees are also facing very similar negative coping strategies and challenges that the Syrian refugees are facing. With that said, however, because the Palestinian refugees are supported by the international aid community, by different UN agencies, so we have UNRWA that is leading most of the response for the Palestinian refugees, and they've suffered also significant challenges and a reduction of their budget, which has also negatively impacted the ability to provide basic services for Palestinian refugees within the Palestinian camps in Lebanon. So I'll just stop there and leave it to further questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally. Epaminondas, if I may rephrase the question about the movement in Greece. Last year, exactly a year ago, there was one movement crisis evolving on the border between Turkey and Greece, when Turkey expelled a number of refugees, and consequently, and in response, the Greek government called in the military to repel the refugees and push them back into Turkey. What were the conditions for, what were the permissive movements of the refugees before the COVID crisis that coincides a little bit with this tension at the border with Turkey? And what are the movement restrictions for the refugees now? Maybe that you can answer this question and lead us on to your, also the first topic that I wish to discuss is, what are the exact numbers of refugees, if we know, in Greece currently? So you can begin with the movement situation or the numbers.
Yes, I'm happy to, George. First of all, George and Kaveh, thank you very much for your most kind introduction and invitation and your respective programs and departments at Yale University. And Sally, so great to meet with you on the occasion of this event. And thank you to everybody that is participating today. George, I have to say that you forgot to say that we've known each other for 20 years, but we were very, very, very young when we met. So I just wanted to say that for the record.
I think that's all. Yes.
But yes, the numbers are a very critical case, and thank you for bringing that up in the opening phase of the discussion. Currently, and according to the UNHCR numbers that are the most reliable, we have a little bit over 100,000 refugees in Greece. And that, as you know, Greece has an approximate population of 10 million people, so that's 0.01% of the population. And Greece, before COVID, was hosting about 25 to 30 million tourists per year. Just to give you some numbers that don't explain really the inability, let's say, of Greece, which is, I believe, the 16th largest economy in the European Union, and is being funded by the European Union to the amount of 3 billion, which is an amazing figure for such a small, quote unquote, number of refugees in Greece. And you have the typical photos and stories of refugees living in very questionable conditions, really conditions that none of us could ever imagine living in these tents, you know, in the islands and in the mainland, flooding with water at every rainfall and experiencing severe cold weather or severe heat, you know, during the summer. So it really, when I started 23 years ago, I was very ambitious that I could really propose some solutions together with my colleagues. But since 2015 that I've been involved in the what they call the response to the refugee crisis. And again, it isn't really a crisis when we are speaking of a European continent of 500 million people. I begin very much to think that it's a crisis or a situation that nobody wants to solve. And the reasons are many, I guess. And we love the Lebanese people. We have very, common characteristics and interests with Lebanon. And while the numbers are quite vastly different between Greece and Lebanon, I think we share a lot of the same challenges that Sally mentioned. So it is really a very difficult situation when you know that the bureaucracy and the corruption that runs within the governmental entities, let's say, that are adopting, and I don't want to be throwing too many numbers, but we seem to, in Greece and in some parts of, I guess, the world, including the US, at least with the previous administration, we seem to be adopting the Hungarian model, let's say, of deterrence for refugees, which is quite simple: make them suffer. Some of them will die also under these policies, in thinking that more people will not come. They will be deterred to coming. So we have the policy of a lot of detention, a lot of illegal pushbacks. That is when you are pushing people that have every right to come to Greece to seek asylum, and you don't give them that right, but you push them back to Turkey, as you mentioned before. And all these policies of really violating human rights of desperate people, really. These are humans that are trying to escape war and other conflicts, climate change and other circumstances that have forced them to leave their homes. And this is how the European Union and Greece is responding to that.
Thank you. Your last point leads me to the next question, and I'll pose it to Epaminondas, and then Sally can respond and give us the Lebanese picture of it. You've talked about human rights violations. There has also been an issue in Greece, at least until last year, of particular political and social resistance coming from the extreme right, the party of Golden Dawn, including instigated violence against the refugees. What is the landscape of human rights violations against the refugees in Greece at this point or over the last year? Is there a broader picture that involves also not just Greece, but also the European Union and its, let's say, complicity or at least tolerance of various discriminatory practices? You mentioned the Hungarian model. How is it taken? What are its contours in Greece particularly? And I know we wanted to talk about the far right attacks, but this can come into the conversation as well, the local resistance to the refugees. That's
yes,
for you.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And we belong to a network that is, along with other colleagues and organizations that are recording these violent attacks against refugees and other vulnerable people, I have to say. It is this climate of creating xenophobia and really a racist reaction to, again, to people trying to flee a war zone. And all around, actually, our neighborhood, quote unquote, in the Balkans and elsewhere, we have seen these violent pushbacks and beatings and from government, let's say, forces and Frontex, and everybody is denying it. But I think NGOs are now equipped with better tools to make their cases. I mean, I think NGOs in the past were also too much on the philosophical and theoretical side of these violations, but now with the assistance of, for example, satellite photos and imagery and other technology tools, we can reconstruct an illegal pushback with our partner, for example, Forensic Architecture, and other colleagues and organizations, and we can really make the case with science of these violations taking place, and we can really record them through mobile phones and other tools. So I don't think anybody anymore doubts that these things are happening. It is a question of the lack of a political will to stop these actions and to move the narrative from really a destructive deterrent to a more positive integration and welcoming of refugees that have so much anyway to contribute to local societies.
Sally, anything to contribute to this question as well? Is there any internal resistance, let's say, to the refugees from the general population?
Yes, definitely. We see in Lebanon significant internal resistance, which really is a political decision and is driven by politics itself. I mean, Lebanon is what we call a consociational democracy. It's made up of different minority groups that hold power. In addition to that, those that hold power were former warlords that led the 15-year civil war that basically negotiated and gave themselves amnesty and have ruled the country since the end of the Lebanese civil war in 1990. Because this very delicate balance between sex, religious sex and communities within the country, it's, you know, the entire sort of political system is driven by the maintenance of this. In Lebanon, just, you know, we haven't had a consensus since 1932 specifically to protect this delicate balance. So with the first onset of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, starting, you know, since 1948 and in subsequent years, they were confined to refugee camps, specifically to not allow the integration of the Palestinian refugees into the Lebanese society, specifically out of fear of their religion. So, you know, it was, you know, political / religious decision, because it would balance the, you know, the figures towards the Muslim community rather than to the Christian community. So and then this was then enshrined in the Lebanese constitution, where specifically it refers to lack of integration of specifically Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So this is a red line for the, you know, for Lebanon. And given this, you know, constitutional precedent with the arrival of Syrian refugees, so the sort of historical experience with the Palestinian refugees also started to emerge, and also given that Lebanon and Syria have also had their sort of political differences, and Lebanon was occupied by Syrian troops for a very long time. So it's a very complicated history, and that the majority of Syrian refugees are thought to be from, you know, are thought to be Muslim. Again, sort of the debate around sort of ethnicity and the protection of the different minority groups in the country re-emerged, and the policy of you know, no integration continued to be a red line. And so what then the government has done is introduced, has committed to the principle of non-refoulement in principle, although this was broken back in 2019 in a few cases, but publicly has committed to the principle of non-refoulement, but integration is a red line and continues to call on more resettlement of refugees globally, but then has introduced a, you know, a collection of different policies that makes the life of refugees in Lebanon extremely difficult. From access to livelihood, to access to legal protection, to access to basic services, to living in, you know, refugee camps or informal tented settlements, etc. So a series of significant policies that make it difficult, and so producing an environment of like push factors for refugees to return themselves to, you know, to the country where they fled, and where we as the international community continue to consider as not safe to return to.
Great, thank you. Kaveh, you can
I actually wanted to return to COVID. Over the weekend, I was happy to read that Lebanon is distributing vaccine. What I'm wondering about is the vaccine also being offered to the Syrian refugees? You know, what is sort of a distribution plan for that, and who's I think the funding came from either World Bank or International Monetary Fund, I'm not sure, but do you know what the plans are for vaccine distribution?
Yes, sure. So the national plan for the deployment of vaccination in Lebanon started on this past Saturday with phase 1, specifically targeting frontline health workers and then over 75s. The current sort of vaccines that arrived to the country were purchased by a World Bank loan that was, you know, already given to the Lebanese government and repurposed to address the COVID-19 pandemic and to purchase the vaccine. Lebanon is also part of the COVAX framework, so there will be more vaccines that will arrive to the country. So only a limited amount have arrived. A part of the vaccination plan in the country includes, I mean, the plan includes any individual living on Lebanese territory. So in principle and in theory, this does include the refugee community, Palestinian and Syrian, as well as migrant workers that are currently living in Lebanon. And theoretically, again, and in principle, this should also apply to individuals who do not have their legal papers in order. And this specifically applies to a lot of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon, as well as stateless individuals. However, we are yet to see if in practice this will be respected and how it will be respected. So it's too early to tell whether this will indeed be abided by and respected. However, there is a third-party monitoring component to the deployment of the vaccines in Lebanon that is run by the International Federation for the Red Cross, and this was a condition of the World Bank loan and the vaccination rollout. And UN agencies in the country have a very large role to play, from the WHO to UNICEF and UNHCR, and there is an expectation that the UN agencies will support the government in the deployment of the vaccines to the refugee community and the migrant community as well, through community-based organizations and centers.
If I can first follow up on that, as you mentioned, only about 10% of the Syrians are actually registered. And my understanding is that a lot of the Syrians are quite fearful of accessing healthcare, even if it is available to them. They don't want to go in because they're worried about potentially getting into some kind of political problem. So there's been a problem with accessing healthcare. And also, we know there is some vaccine hesitancy. I don't know whether there's any information known about the Syrian population. Do they have information about the vaccine? Do they trust it, given all the tensions you just described? And also, you mentioned all the restrictions. So would the vaccine be taken into these informal tent settlements, or would the Syrians be expected to? How is that? It seems so complicated for them to actually get access to these vaccines.
It's a very, very important question that you're posing, Kaveh, and I don't really have the answer to that just yet, because again, the principle is there, the commitment on paper is there to provide the vaccines to everyone on Lebanese territory, but the how will this actually be operationalized remains a question mark. Yes, there is a lot of question marks around the vaccine within all communities in Lebanon, and so there's been an extensive now communications and outreach plan around the vaccine and the safety of the vaccine and the importance of taking the vaccine should it be offered to you, is now being implemented by the Lebanese government with support of UN agencies, local organizations, as well as international NGOs such as Oxfam, and taking a very community-based approach. Also, the expectation is likely that the public health clinics of the Ministry of Public Health, as well as local NGO networks, will play a significant role in providing the vaccines at the community level, especially to refugees, and to encourage them not to be fearful of the potential security concerns that they may have in movement towards accessing the vaccine. But again, we're very, very early days, and the details are yet to be seen and how this will actually be rolled out.
Thank you.
Great. Epaminondas, I know this was a topic we wanted to discuss today as well, and actually we have a couple of questions from the audience already on this topic. What has been the Greek response to COVID-19 in terms of testing, prevention? What is the policy for the vaccines now? Maybe give us a broader picture of what is happening as well in Greece on this topic.
Yes. So it's a very similar situation as Sally describes for Lebanon and Greece as well. We are in a rather strict lockdown, much more strict than last March, when we had quite a few cases, and it was considered from a statistics point of view to be a successful response to COVID-19 in Greece. But since the summer, and especially let's say the holiday season, we really have a lot of cases, and it's not only the number of cases in terms of the population, but it's really the number of places in the ICUs, in the hospitals around Greece that are almost 90%, I understand today, filled. So it's quite difficult because from COVID, I mean, so it's quite difficult if there is another emergency, for example, the hospitals cannot respond to that. I have to say that we get the vaccines centrally from the European Union. And we are now up to, I believe 5% of the population has been vaccinated. So it's quite early on, as Sally said. And there is no news actually on whether vulnerable groups, including, for example, homeless people, HIV patients, or other vulnerable groups, are included in that list to be vaccinated, and especially migrants and refugees, as you mentioned, George, with the nationalistic feelings and the far-right attacks. The narrative is already against vaccinating anybody else that is not actually a resident or a Greek citizen. So we will see when we come up to that situation, and it's a big advocacy ask for many organizations and stakeholders here in Greece to include all vulnerable people in the vaccination. Otherwise, we cannot really reach a level of immunity as a country. And of course, there are other exclusions as well. We understand that there's going to be a COVID-19 sort of passport for you to travel. That would apply also for refugees that are recognized and are able to travel. If they don't have the vaccine, perhaps they will not be able to travel, or they would be discriminated against. It certainly doesn't cover undocumented people, as Sally said. I believe in Greece you need to have a social security number to be on the platform, and this is a very low percentage of vulnerable populations or refugees that have that social security number or a similar number that is now produced. So it remains to be seen. I think also what Kaveh mentioned is that so many countries around the world, I believe 130, do not have vaccines for the moment. So it remains to be seen how this distribution and the possible problems in this distribution will come about. But as usual, the refugees have no name in this process. They are not named anywhere, or they're not protected. Their health rights are not protected. So it remains to be seen what will happen.
Kaveh, if I may continue with
Please.
sort of similar question parallel. Epaminondas, this is a question about the political resistance to the refugees from the extreme right. And we know that Golden Dawn has been disbanded as a political party in Greece, but that is not the end of the resistance from the far right. To give you an example of how misinformation or the discussion may be derailed in directions that approach Islamophobia. This morning, I received a message on Facebook, an article in a Greek newspaper that is highlighting or exposing what they call underage brides among the refugees, right? This comes at a moment when Greece is undergoing its own Me Too movement, right? Revelations and allegations of sexual abuse and rape in athletics, but also in the artistic world. So it is telling for me that there's this injection of a topic that is directed now towards refugees as gangs of pedophilias that are bringing underage girls as their wives. So how is Greek society addressing this residual, and I would say it's not even residual, it's still kind of politically active through other agencies of the political system. How is Greek society prepared to address the legacy of Golden Dawn. Surely the problem is not gone just because the party is gone, and it manifests itself in other ways. Distraction is one of them, or changing the conversation that is happening in Greece about Greece and projecting it onto the refugees. And might I say, there is child marriage legally here in the US, but nobody talks about it, right? So how is this sort of propaganda war addressed in Greece, if it is addressed?
That is excellent, George. I totally agree with you, and it's one of the most basic now issues. I mean, all of us in the NGO sector, I believe we have missed this global movement of fake news. And make no mistake that the Capitol events and Charlottesville a few years ago, and other events in Germany and elsewhere in Europe are very connected. If there are very specific YouTube channels and other social media that ignite these events and increase followers and revenues for the far-right parties and rhetoric. Now, as you said, Golden Dawn was really already a violent and marginal neo-Nazi group in the 80s. They had a rapid rise for a decade between 2010 and 2020, where they achieved close to 10% of the popular vote, let's say, in Greece, despite ongoing criminal actions by this group. Finally, last October 7, 2020, historic day, I believe, for democracy, in the largest post-World War II trial of neo-Nazis, let's say, more than 50 members of that group were convicted to prison terms, including the leadership who received 10 to 15 years in prison. One of them actually is now a member of the European Parliament, and I hope soon that he would be brought to justice as well. I mean, he is convicted, but he has immunity because of his political status at the moment. Now, 5.5 years, over 150 witnesses and hundreds of other, thousands of documents and evidence, and many courageous pro bono lawyers, I have to say, that gave their whole, life going after this case. And as you say, there is a big now void in that sector. I mean, this more than 500,000 voters that were voting for this group of criminals is now looking for a place to ideologically to go. And there is another far-right, let's say, party called the Greek Solution in Greece that we don't think will be able to cover all the space. And everything that we are discussing here today is feeding to that narrative. For example, this other party came out today and said about the cases that you were describing, which are not proven to be true, and the district attorney is actually announced today that he's opening up the investigation on those matters. So whenever we say that there needs to be a sort of controlled migration integration, the far-right groups comes and say, we don't want any migration. When we are in power, we are going to throw the refugees out and block any refugees from coming. We know, of course, that is not practically possible, but they're taking advantage of reasonable fears by the local population, or the circumstances, the financial circumstances. One can only imagine with unemployment rate currently at 16% in Greece, how much that will deteriorate post-COVID-19. So the far right is there to take advantage of all this situation, and every little issue is blamed on the refugees, as if they were even blamed in the beginning from bringing COVID-19 into Greece, which is totally fake, and it was proven not to be. But you know how it is. You get to the fake news side of the story, and then there is nobody coming to say that that eventually wasn't true. So I think that is the most challenging, if I may say so now, problem for us in the civil society sector, is how to handle the fake news and the far-right attacks on democracy that we see today.
Great. Kaveh, I know you need to leave around 1, so
Yes.
I want to give you the chance to ask
Thank
Sally
you.
and Epaminondas whatever questions you may still have.
Thank you so much. You know, last time I was in Lebanon, I think it was November 2019, and I remember speaking to one of the humanitarian organizations, and he was telling me that some of the Syrian refugees with like cancer problems who couldn't access treatment in Lebanon, they couldn't pay for it. They were not being, their expenses were not being covered by UN agencies. They literally returned back to Syria to try to get treatment for their cancer care. And I've been hearing that there's other Syrians who are moving out of Lebanon back to Syria. Can you give us a sense of what is going on? And is it economic reason, social reason, political reason, public health reason? Like, what is happening with the return of refugees to a very risky situation back in Syria?
Sure. There's, it's all of the above, basically. There's many reasons that drive, refugee population movements to move both, inside Lebanon, but specifically back to Syria, or even, forwards to take a very dangerous and risky trip to migrate out to sea. Movements within the country, let's say, are mainly driven by by safety issues and safety concerns. So there's been various waves of evictions across the country, both from actual villages and that no longer have the hospitality or the tolerance for the refugee communities. And or increased tensions between the host communities and the Syrian refugee communities, and so the Syrian refugee communities start to move across the country. The evictions are as a result, again, of safety and security, or just the inability to pay rent anymore, given the very dire economic and vulnerable situation of these communities. Back to Syria is driven by many factors. Before 2015, the border was still open between Syria and Lebanon, and so we used to see a lot of movement by the refugee communities, either to go back to Syria and access healthcare, or to even be able to, to check on their assets and their homes if they were still standing, to check on family members, or to do various other errands, life errands that needs to happen. But as of 2015, the border was shut, and now what we have is a few porous parts of the border that are still used illegally for smuggling routes, and we see some movement in both directions. So Syrians continue fleeing the war in Syria, but also refugees going back to Syria. A lot of it is driven by economic reasons, and we have heard refugees say, "I would rather die in my own country starving rather than to die displaced in Lebanon starving." Sadly, this is how dire the situation is. We also hear, "I would rather die of COVID than to die of hunger." This is, something that refugee communities are saying, but also Lebanese communities are saying, because of the, serious also economic vulnerabilities that the Lebanese host community are also experiencing, which is also creating tensions among the two groups. The various policies that are in place that I previously mentioned before of the Lebanese government, both at the local municipal level, but more nationally, that are really becoming more and more restrictive. So the inability to access livelihoods in Lebanon, both from a legal perspective, but now from an economic perspective, even more so. But there's also been some organized returns by the Lebanese government, by the Lebanese General Security, which started in summer of 2019. So, the General Security says that these are, purely voluntary, that, these are organized with the necessary political approvals on the other side of the border, and that refugees are, free and willing to come and register their names. And once the checks are done on the other side of the border, they're free to get on these buses and be bussed back across the border. As a humanitarian agency, we do question the pure, voluntariness of these returns. They have stopped in the last year due to the COVID pandemic, but we have now heard that these organized returns are going to be picked up again by the general security. So we're likely to see a re-emergence of these return movements. And finally, just to say that we are also seeing movements of migration by sea, by Syrian refugees, by Palestinian refugees, but even Lebanese families also more recently fleeing, again, the extremely dire economic situation among all three communities right now due to the triple or quadruple crises that the country is witnessing, sadly.
Thank you so much. Apologies, I do need to get on another call, but I really learned a lot and I enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaveh, for being with us. And we will continue a little bit more of the conversation with the panelists. And then we actually have a surprise guest commentator, also a specialist in immunology and communicable diseases that we will elevate to the status of host once we finish with our panelists. But I wanted to continue, maybe, Sally, a question for you. And I know you have been doing work on this topic. We have been talking about refugees here as if it's one unvariegated group with no distinctions or declensions within that group. And maybe you can address some of the problems that specific groups are facing. For instance, I know you've been working on health issues with women. What is the situation? What are the particular problems that this particular group is facing that are not universal to the entire refugee populations in either country, actually? So is there an issue with health issues that is not addressed, for instance? And maybe later on, Epaminondas, if there's any realization of this, I don't want to call them secondary because they're not secondary problems, they're primary problems, but is there a way to address particular groups within the refugees? Children, for instance, women, old people, whatever the sort of parameters of the makeup of the populations are. So Sally, you go first because I know you've done a lot of work on this topic.
Thanks, George. Yes, it's easy to look at all communities and all population groups as one, but that's not necessarily the case. And among the refugee community specifically, we've seen the impact of the lockdowns and also the dire economic situation fall extremely heavily on women and women-headed households, as well as people living with disabilities. So these population groups are more heavily impacted and have been by the current situation. We've seen an alarming spike in the number of gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence among the refugee communities. But I mean, and this has been a point of concern. Especially with the lockdowns and the inability of free movement, or the economic impact of these lockdowns and situations have increased stress and mental health issues, and we're seeing it also translate in intimate partner violence as well. So these are very worrying trends that are being documented among the refugee communities. And what's happening is that there's an inability as well to access safe spaces for women that are survivors of sexual and gender-based violence because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the need to test, the need to isolate, and all of that. So the centers that were previously accessible to survivors are no longer there. Also, we're seeing the reporting of these worrying trends to be to also not be very consistent as previous, and we are our analysis is the reasons for this is because potentially women are in this case are not able to access their phones, for example, freely to be able to report these their situation and these cases. So sadly, we are seeing some worrying trends. The response is trying its best to address this, but because of the pandemic and because of the lockdown, and so some of the tools that were accessible before are not as accessible as they have been, and also there's a significant rise in mental health challenges across all communities because of the lockdown and the dire economic situation, the high levels of stress, and the negative coping mechanisms that women and other members of the households are having to resort to, including what we're seeing is also a rise in child labor, sadly, to be able to cope with the challenges that these households are facing.
Great. Epaminondas, has there been any investigation of what is happening within the camps, at least the last year, in respect to issues of sexual violence, harassment? I know that the recent and very new discussion that Greece is having about its own culture of sexual violence has implicated a young, mostly male adolescent migrant children, but less so, I guess, of refugee adolescents that are in the camps. Has the knowledge come forth of what is going on in the camps and maybe outside the camps with respect to these issues? Women's health, domestic abuse, or is it just evolving along with the rest of the conversation about Greece's internal sexual culture?
Yes, George, it is as you suggest. First of all, I think, for example, the Lesvos island, that is a more, let's say, infamous case of a refugee camp. I'm going to tell the numbers, but it's nothing compared to Lebanese camps. But when you have, at one point, we had the maximum 20,000 people at the camp with a capacity for 3,000 people. You can understand that we cannot talk about health and safety or social distancing or security at night. We just assisted, actually, members of our team assisted an LGBTQI person to come from the islands to the mainland. And you can imagine the risks for this person under these conditions. And this 12 or 20,000 depends on what flows we have access to very few restrooms, let's say, facilities, not enough food, not enough water, no medicine, no doctors, all this happening again inside the European Union. And then comes COVID and makes the situation really unbearable, because even though ourselves as let's say, residents here are going in and out of lockdowns, the refugees are in a permanent state of lockdown. They cannot, they have curfews, they cannot exit the camps. They are fined for no reason, with heavy fines if they are found somewhere else, even though if they have the proper justification for that. They can't even understand these difficult regulations that we even have a problem of understanding for the lockdown. So, but especially, if you are in this situation for many months or years, some refugees are in this situation for more than 3 years now. then everybody is vulnerable. But especially, as you mentioned, George and Sally, especially the women. For example, single mothers or single women in a camp, it's quite impossible to live in a camp under that situation. You have a lot of multiple risks. There is no police at night, so incidents are not really recorded. We have most of the population right now of refugees are women and children, actually. And among them, we have 4,000 children, almost 4,000 children that are unaccompanied without any parent here in Greece. And almost half of them are not in good conditions. For example, they are in what they call a safe zone in a camp, which is really nothing but safe at night. So there is a lot of sexual abuse. A lot of the population is, for example, Afghani males or young boys that are, after suffering all this journey and the circumstances, they're really mature boys that have no future in Europe. They're not accepted anywhere. They have very low chances of getting recognized or getting into the labor market, especially after COVID. So there are many risks to the population that regretfully we are not addressing. And as you and Sally, especially Sally, said, I have to stay on the mental health concern and aspects. I mean, if we are having such a severe, let's say, mental health issues after COVID for a year now, you can imagine these people without any counseling, without any protection, what they are going through. There are multiple reports of suicide attempts in the camps, even by children. So it's a very difficult situation that we don't want to address, I'm afraid. We don't want to intervene and help. And if I may make this comment, I know Sally is an expert, but maybe the numbers in Lebanon are so huge, but in Greece, again, 0.01% of the population. It's something that we should have managed a lot better, and we are not doing it.
Actually, I want to thank Sally for bringing up this topic, because I think it's a critical one. Those of us that enter this conversation out of some humanitarian empathy for the refugees, maybe we naively and dangerously neglect the fact that refugees come with their own biases and with their own prejudices as well, some of which are manifested as misogyny towards their own women populations, or in some cases, homophobia. So it is, I think, imperative to kind of shed light on these particular topics, because they tend to ignore an issue that is not exogenous to the communities that are coming into either Lebanon or Greece, but also endogenous. That we also need to be aware that there's this danger of exacerbating and amplifying certain problems that are prevalent in many societies, but are amplified by the conditions of the camps. We are over the hour. I want to maybe allow our guest panelist now, that is Yannis Mameladzis was here last year, right? In January, talking about HIV prevention.
Yeah, we would have known that we would be a year later talking about a pandemic, and didn't foresee it.
So we want to acknowledge his contribution. He has been, actually, I've been communicating with Yannis every now and then for speakers and things. So Yannis also works for the WHO and is intimately involved with the whole situation of the COVID in Greece. But maybe you can tell us, first of all, tell us a little bit more about what you do, and then how you see the situation in Greece with COVID and the refugees.
Great, thank you, George. Really great to see you. Kaveh was my Yale advisor. I did my master's in public health at Yale and worked at the School of Medicine, where I sort of began my career in infectious disease epidemiology. My work has been largely focused on HIV and in the biomedical prevention of HIV for many years now at WHO. And thank you to on the reflections by the speakers this morning, this afternoon. My base is in Switzerland, and I'm a consultant for WHO. I'm Greek American, and currently in Florida because I'm not riding out the winter in Geneva or Athens on lockdown. So I prefer to I have the luxury to be able to do this. But I was in Greece, actually, there's a small country office team for the World Health Organization in Athens. And I went there in April and stayed through the summer, working on COVID-19 on sort of all matters of the response and providing technical assistance to the government. So like many people who work in infectious diseases, everybody has pivoted towards working in COVID-19. And so kind of this is the area of work. I left Greece in early October. I actually visited Lesvos a few days before the refugee camp in Moria burnt down. And I went there actually on an independent trip, irrespective of what WHO had. And it was really to work with some colleagues and get to know some of the actors on the ground and the NGOs that are operating there, and really see for myself actually what was happening. Because if you're working on COVID-19 testing, contact tracing issues, you know, a whole spectrum of issues. And one is, you know, my interest was always a kind of vulnerable populations, and included in that are migrants and refugees, of course. It's one thing to be kind of reading the literature, talking to the partners through Zoom, and it's another thing to actually be going in and actually having a better assessment of what's going on. So I did that, and I never actually had the chance to visit Moria because it burnt down as I went there. And so I think fast forward now, we are in February 2021. Just to give you a little bit more context on what has happening with COVID-19 in Greece, and what I see is really critical around the response and kind of the needs of refugees and migrants. We are very lucky to have effective, safe vaccines. The problem is, you know, at a global level, it's a supply issue, as you all know. And then what's happening is we will have, you know, we're going to have sort of a two-speed or sort of countries that are faster in implementing COVID-19 vaccinations, and others in a much slower pace. And so this inequity creates problems in terms of reaching levels of herd immunity at a global level. So it's a little bit naive to think that we are going to be ready to get back to normality, as we'd like to say, and some of our politicians would like to claim, by June. I think in some specific states, health jurisdictions, and some European countries, yes, that will be the case because the vaccines are so highly effective in preventing hospitalization and death. There is evidence from the vaccines there are signals that it is also reducing your risk of getting infected and onward transmission. But as we're vaccinating right now, we're prioritizing those at older age is the major risk factor. And there have been some people that have been vaccinated from the refugee community. We've had over 600,000 vaccinations, at least one dose that's happened since vaccination began in late December in Greece. I just always caution that I think the challenge will be, as we get down to the younger groups, is how to ensure that we have, ensure equity in immunization for refugees, migrants. And I think the challenge that our colleagues have noted is actually those who are documented, who are formally documented in the country would have access to vaccination. And that's not sufficient. We need to be vaccinating everybody. And so I remain quite concerned about how we just need to be advocating and addressing the equity issues for all vulnerable populations. A second point I'd like to make is around the impact of lockdowns. So we talk about maybe getting back to normality, but the impact and the implications of lockdown on mental health, as Sally kind of rightfully pointed out to, I think it's is ignored. It's a critical one. It's the impact of this will come back to haunt us as societies, and also obviously the individuals that have experienced the trauma of lockdowns. And then the third point is also we have to recognize that a segment of the general population that has been infected with COVID-19, including in that refugees and migrants, will experience long-term complications from this infection. So it's what we call long haulers. And so this is an area sort of clinically that we're trying to better understand. So again, there's, we have to confront that issue as well. And so getting back to normality by June 1st, just because Greece's economy rests on tourism, I think is a little bit naive in my viewpoint. And it really is like, your neighbor needs to be protected for you to be protected. And I think from a public health rationale, that's, that makes sense. But we just need to further advocate for that when we are kind of in halls of decision making. And it's really critical to be engaging with civil society partners. I mean, I come from an HIV background. We don't create policy, make guidelines unless we have people living with HIV in the room. That's how we do business. And I think the same thing has to be applied when we're thinking about how to develop programs, how to create policy in the COVID-19 response. We don't have enough input, obviously, from the communities that we should be serving, and this is influenced by politics and not public health and not human rights. And so kind of I think that's kind of, I just wanted to give you a sense and a perspective from somebody who did work for a period in Greece, but has been also trying to support both the Ministry of Health and other partners and civil society actors, which I think the government should be doing greater efforts in engaging with civil society if it really wants to achieve what it's trying to achieve.
Thank you, Johnny. And we had a couple of questions from the audience, but I think those particular people who posed the questions left, and the questions, I remember them, they were a little general, and I'm not sure if our panelists can answer them. One of them had to do with what is the reception rate of refugees of various European countries at this moment. This is the orientation that I tried not to follow, but if anyone has an answer, and maybe it's a moot point at this moment in history because we're all locked down wherever we are. But okay, Epaminondas, you have some comments on it.
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's one of my favorite topics, and the quick answer is very low. I mean, for example, Belgium is 0. And you would imagine that Belgium, you would be resettling groups there. But you're right, George, if you're talking about during COVID-19, it's especially very difficult for all of us to travel. So there has been it's been very slow to resettle refugees and migrants, with the exception of a few, I think, unaccompanied children. We haven't seen really any other traveling. But ideally, again, with the European Union and conflicts in the Middle East running for many years, decades, I would say, and climate change coming, don't forget that parameter, because we have now about 25 million people refugees and then 40 million people displaced in their own countries. So that number, 65 million, is going to go dramatically upwards with climate change, and actually the evacuation, let's say, of refugees from Syria, the origins of that movement was climate change. So I think we have to come to an understanding, and it has to be a political decision, which our politicians are reluctant to take, that the European Union is a very wealthy continent. It has labor needs and it has other needs as well, that refugees could be helpful. It is a continent of 500 million people, and we should come to an understanding of how many thousand can legally, with legal and safe pathways, can come directly from the Middle East to the European Union and then allocated to member states on an equal basis. There could be a lot of variables that I couldn't really, I'm not an expert to tell you, but it could be GDP per capita, population, and we have to go all the way down to the community level to set up these algorithms. And I think that we have fantastic people that can figure this out, and it would be a benefit for local communities as well. And you would disrupt also this, I believe it is something like a $16 billion network of people trying to smuggle refugees inside Europe, and also all the funds being spent on police and other border controls to keep people out. So that's a total waste of money that could really go on integration and education for refugees.
Okay, Sally, if I may direct a question to you about this topic, is there any debate in Lebanon and in the broader region there about other countries receiving more refugees? Egypt, Saudi Arabia, what is there a debate about relieving Lebanon of some of the burden by neighboring countries? It was one issue that kept coming up in the past when the European Union was criticized. What is happening in the broader region of the Middle East in terms of absorption of refugees?
I mean, in the region, none really. I mean, there's various challenges that most countries in the region are suffering. I mean, we have Iraq that has significant amount of internally displaced populations and their own crises and security challenges. Syria is we know very well what the situation is like there. Jordan has severe economic crisis and closed the borders to Syria and Iraq at a certain point in time as well. Egypt, complete also economic meltdown and collapse, and the Gulf states are good in making sure to invest money elsewhere and to take political and security decisions elsewhere, but not as hospitable in terms of policy of resettlement, certainly than the European Union or any other countries in the West. So this is not really a discussion or a debate anymore necessarily. It comes up every now and then, the fair share of resettlement. It was very much on the agenda a few years ago, but there's sadly there's acceptance that this is there's definitely we've hit a brick wall. I mean, there will always continue to be some countries that are thankfully accepting more resettlement cases, but obviously this is peanuts compared to the caseload of refugees in the region. I mean, the Middle East hosts the largest numbers of refugees in the world, as my colleague Epaminondas, sorry, I can't pronounce your name properly, I apologize, has referred to. I mean, we are. The situation is going to be more dire as climate change takes a stronger hold in the region, and we are likely to see climate refugees and migration from the region due to climate change as well.
Thank you, Sally. We're running out of time, and I want to close maybe with one comment. First of all, I want to thank everyone who took part in the conversation today, and Kaveh, obviously, who has left, and Yanis. But I want to close with maybe one comment that you made, Yanis, about going back to normality. I'm wondering after this debate whether normality is where we want to go back to anyway. The challenges are so immense. We need to be thinking of new models and new policies and maybe an entirely different new normal. If normal is something that we can apply at any moment in history to such difficult and challenging situation that refugees find themselves. It will take a lot of work, and I'm glad to see people like you working in this field, and maybe we can hope in imagining what the future and the new normality might be. And I want to thank also our audience. This was our first event of the semester, and we have a lot of things coming up from the Hellenic Studies. A couple of talks about the international aspect of the Greek Revolution, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year, and also a panel discussion on sexual violence in Greece coming up in the middle of March, a panel on the Asian Olympics towards the end of April, as well as a host of other wonderful things coming up in May and June, when we will extend our program of activities into the summer. So I want to thank everybody here for the debate, and bid you all goodbye until next time.
Thank you very much, George. Really wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.